My name is Boulevard, your name is whatever your name is, and we're both here because it's Friday. It's time for another tournament Tactician. Feels weird putting these out on Fridays still because these are such jam-packed days for tournaments now with Giant Slayer running both European and North American events all on the same day. You have a full action-packed day of tournaments, and hopefully between it you can find time to watch this video and prep yourself for the tournaments coming up this weekend. The online league series will be running again. The Team IQ Invitational is happening, but that is an invitational, so we're not really going to focus on it. Instead, we're going to go with the 3-deck region-locked format that the online league series is running, as well as touch on the Riot format because the seasonal tournament is approaching and the meta shouldn't change too much between now and then. So as has become the standard meta for these tournament tactician videos, that we're going to go over the tier list, what changed from last week, what I was right about, what I was wrong about, what I think is going to happen this weekend. So first off, Draven Ezreal has overtaken Swain Ezreal, not only as the Noxus Piltover Zaun Ezreal deck of the meta, but also just as the forefront Ezreal deck that everybody is seeing. Swain, not as consistent as everybody liked. The efficiency of the Swain package just wasn't really getting it done there. Sure, having the fearsome attacker was cool, but it looks like Swain is just going to be in the backseat for a little while, which is totally fine. He's had his limelight since the release of Rising Tides. I'm fine if we don't play any Swain decks for a little while. But Swain Ezreal does still have some different matchups from Draven Ezreal, but overall this one has a better spread. Shen Fiora overtook Scouts, like I said it would. That's all well and good. Discard aggro wasn't legal for most tournaments last weekend because of the Jinx bug that has now been fixed. So this is sort of the first weekend for it. Aggro hasn't been super prevalent in the last couple of tournaments, and I think part of that was the illegality of discard aggro. That's something that's really a pillar of a lineup like that. And there just isn't really a Noxus aggro deck that feels like it competes right now. Maybe Draven Ezreal could even take the spot of discard aggro, or at least in a lineup like that you could have substituted it in, but because Draven Ezreal was more of a this week adaptation, I don't blame players for not going for it. So discard aggro is one to keep an eye out for, but I mean, aggro has been struggling in this meta, so we'll have to check back on that one a little bit later. Starspring I still think is good, but it's becoming a lot more matchup dependent, which is expected of a deck that plays almost, unilaterally towards this alternate win condition. And with go hard decks, while pack your bags isn't a deal breaker for this deck, a lot of Ruinations running around, and that is something that is difficult for Starspring to deal with, as well as main decked crumbles out of a couple of those go hard decks, which, once the Starspring dies, that's it. If all three of them are dead, or if two of them die and you never find the third one, any combination of that kind of stuff, you are not actually going to win that game unless you're going for the Zenith Blade version, which opens up its other problems because it's very difficult to try and fight over a Star Shepherd, something with that low of an initial HP threshold. Pack your bags will actually do a number on that one. And there's a couple of other play arounds for it. But I still have confidence in Starspring. I still think it's very good. Back Alley Poker, I had it in tier 2 last week. It's moved up to tier 1 because it was a deck that wasn't figured out yet, and I think people are much more confident in the lists that they have now. Gangplank coming out a lot more, although a couple people are switching back to Elise because they feel they need to be a little bit more aggressive, but they're really streamlining the spell lineup. They're really starting to figure out the lists, and I think that Back Alley Poker is going to be one of the things that you have to keep in the back of your head when you're going into a tournament, especially a Riot tournament, because I do think there are actually 3 good go-hard decks that you could feasibly run in a lineup, and I'll get into that when we get to the lineup section. But overall, Back Alley Poker should be a tournament staple for the weekend. The problem with it is it's very difficult to play, so I wouldn't expect your average player to be running it. I don't think it's going to appear in sort of the most popular lineups, but I think that a lot of the better players in the game are going to be packing this. Frostbite midrange, insane ban rate, good win percentage, just really solid deck into the meta. Doesn't really need an explanation. Leona Luxol, sort of same thing. Curious about where this one's actually going to land. I was really hoping it would do very well, and it seemed to perform to my expectations, but now we're not seeing as much aggro, we're not seeing as much tempo. Things like the go hard decks are just really value oriented, and I think that they can outvalue the Leona Luxol variants, so I am a little bit curious about this one. I'm not even sure I would want to put it in tier 1. If I had a tier 1.5, I'd probably put it there, but I'd say like low tier 1, high tier 2, either one of those a consideration. But I do think that the power of the deck is there, and the invoke mechanic's still very strong. Just Falling Comet has so much use in the meta right now, and this just is the deck that has some of the most Celestial Generation lineup. And then we have Harrowing Anivia. I thought this was going to become the best Shadow Isle Failure deck after the nerfs to Wording Stone and Trundle. It looks like I was right on that. It's had a lot of success over the last couple of weeks, or last week specifically, and then a little bit this week as we had some weekday tournaments. and it's just really performing admirably. It has a good matchup into the Frostbite mid-range, which is sort of the boogeyman of the format right now. So Herring and Nivea actually doing absolutely fine. It doesn't necessarily have a bad back alley matchup. It's kind of awkward because they need to pack your bags to clear out the Anivias, and then if they have enough 1 damage removal to pick off the Anivias, cool, great. But it's not super likely, and there is enough healing in the Anivia deck that a bunch of pack your bags to your face are not a death sentence, and you have Avalanche and Withering Wail to clean up some of the smaller boards that a deck like that is presenting. But with so many boogeymen in the format, it's hard to counter pick the right ones, but I do think that Anivia is a very safe pick right now, which feels kind of weird to say. Then in Tier 2, I still have Ramsel. I don't think this one's moved since it came out. It's just been sitting at the top of the Tier 2. Granted, this is not like in order. I don't think Ramsel is like the best Tier 2 deck, but I do think that Ramsel is still a contender. Pretty sleeper. I don't think that you're going to see this one, but I do still think that the power is there. It's still like the Ramp Trundle deck that I probably respect the most. Because, you know, it is the one that was running like Voices of the Old One or Faces of the Old One, and I guess Voices of the Old One too, that's a card as well. But this was always like the hard ramp into the Acel kind of deck, and I do think, especially with Field of Rush, you know, it might still be something. It's very untested though. It might not deserve to be there, but you know, deep we see people fall back on a lot. There's a lot of deep going around. I don't think it's going to be as popular going into this weekend as it was last weekend. It's always sort of just like that week 1 default, and we did see a lot of players pick it up in week 1, but I do think going forward, people are going to fall off of it. I am curious to see how it does work out though, because I don't know much about its back alley poker matchup or its go hard matchup in general, and I think a lot of Tier 2 decks are going to rise to prominence based on their go hard matchup. Nightfall, still a deck. Mystrates, picking up a lot of popularity across a lot of different regional combinations. I know I talk a lot about Go Get It Mystrates, but there's also Pale Cascade and Relentless Pursuit Mystrates. And I actually did a whole video on this channel of an overview of the deck and the breakdowns on why you run the different cards. So if you are curious why it's in Tier 2, go check that out. I think it's a great way to round out a aggro lineup with any leftover region that you have, and I definitely like it a lot more than Nightfall right now. Targon Lee Sin, probably a little sleeper at the moment. You're really not seeing it in a lot of lineups, but it does have a pretty solid go hard matchup. If we're going into a go hard meta, Nopify and Deny get a lot more value, because if you can deny the first go hard or Nopify the first go hard, you are preventing the shuffle of the additional copies into your opponent's deck. And if they can never get that train going, a lot of these decks are going to fumble, especially Back Alley Poker, which is currently built as a turbo go hard deck, you know, running triple Zap Spray Fin, some of them even playing Chronicler of Ruins in order to recycle Zap Spray Fins and just get to these go hards and pack your bags as fast as possible. If you're running something like Lee Sin and you have those Nopifies and you can afford to run that because of the style of deck that you are, yeah, you have a great matchup into something like that if you can get those cards offline. It's a little bit of a risky strategy, but they also don't deal with the Lee Sin particularly well, especially as more and more of them cut Vile Feast in order to streamline their position to go get the go hard, and then they don't have any way to pop your spell shield. You know, and the Vengeance doesn't take care of the Lee Sin, the Bastions do double work, the Zed also gets a lot of value because they don't have any 2 damage things. They'd have to get like a keg into a go hard, but even then, you know, once you get that Zenith Blade online with the Zed, it's just a little bit too much for them to handle, and overall Lee Sin just does very, very well into these go hard decks, so I am curious to track that one. I'm not sure how it deals into the rest of the meta. It's a little bit awkward, but like I said, it's a very matchup dependent meta right now, and that makes it hard to track because, as you can see, I have a shit ton of decks on this tier list. It's hard to know how each one of them pairs in each one, especially when a lot of them aren't seeing tournament play. But continuing down, Spider Aggro, really kind of fallen off, but still a solid deck. Targon Vimer, some people consider this, I think Alan ZQ had said it was the best deck in the game, but nobody really knows how to play it super well. I'm not sure about its go hard matchup. I would imagine it's not great. Pack Your Bags destroys everything in this deck, including Vi, who isn't leveled. So not feeling super confident about Targon Vimer if that is the meta that we're approaching into. And it's hard to say because that shouldn't be the meta at large. It should be the top cut meta, the go hard decks, because they're difficult to play and things like that. I'll get into that in lineups a little bit later. I want to continue down this tier list. Scouts have fallen to the wayside of Shen Fiora because Bilgewater likes to be committed elsewhere, especially in region locked formats like the Online League Series is going to be this weekend. Here in Tier 1, we see Star Spring and Back Alley Poker, both as premier Bilgewater options, but Scouts, of course, an old favorite. Definitely still fun to fall back on. Swain Ezreal falls down because Draven Ezreal overtook it. Spooky Karma, you know, still a go hard deck, still feeling pretty good. Not as consistent. It feels like there's a lot of fluff in the spooky Karma decks right now. They are about as inconsistent as they have ever been. There's a lot of combo pieces and a lot of cards that just aren't doing anything. And it almost starts to feel more like a combo deck in some hands than a control deck, which doesn't work out for it more often than not. We've seen it pick up some hard losses over the last weekend. Go Hard Ezreal is sort of the new Karina control that doesn't run Karina. Some people run Karina in it. It's effectively just a Go Hard via Ezreal deck. You know what I'm saying? You can check out the deck list here. Feel the Rush Trundle Tryndamere has come back a little bit, as there is the Yeti version, the Ancient Yeti, Avaros and Trapper version, and then there's the more streamlined, this is War Mothers, but with Feel the Rush. So it is picking up a little bit more in popularity. They have cut wording stones across the board, so, you know, you are still going for this Trundle Tryndamere. I'm not in love with it. I don't hate it. It's a solid deck, but it's definitely not the boogeyman of the format anymore. That definitely goes more towards things like Ezreal and Go Hard, but it's still a solid option, especially if you've been looking for a reason to run Ancient Yeti. And then Targon Overwhelm is sort of the new kid on the block in terms of Noxus aggro. He's been around for a couple of weeks. I don't have a sample list in here yet. Hopefully by the time this video goes live and you actually click on the tier list, I will have found a sample deck list, because there are a couple of tournaments going on right now. But this is a pretty powerful, it's just like the new Darius deck. And what I mean by that is Darius decks have popped in and out of the format before. They don't hold on to cards super well. They play a very face. You know, there's going to be decimates. You have to watch out for the burn. And there's not an insane amount of healing in the format. So I think that's why we're seeing this start to pop back up and the archetype be experimented with a little bit more. And Decisive Maneuver is sort of the key card that is being run as multiple copies of across every Targon Overwhelm deck that I've seen in the past. So yeah, that is just kind of something to watch out for. It's another great option for your Noxus if you don't want to play discard aggro or Draven Ezreal or whatever. The problem that we're running into with Noxus, especially with the Riot format, you know, you can't overlap on champions, and Draven is an integral part of both discard aggro and Draven Ezreal, and sure, you can run Targon Overwhelm without it, but it does generally get included in the deck, so you do have to make some considerations if you're trying to run triple Noxus aggro going into a Riot format tournament. And then tier 3 is just kind of the stuff that's been left over, some decks that are in the past. You know, they're still very playable. Zombie Ash, maybe not so much. This one's very hard meta call. I don't think it really fits into this meta. Then like Dragons, Nab, God, I miss Nab almost, probably not. Karma Ezreal, not something that we're seeing a lot. War Mother's control, just worse. Feel the Rush, especially with the nerf to Wording Stone. TF Swain, I think, has pretty much completely fallen off at this point. I don't think I saw any in the Fight Nights this week. There might have been one, but it's definitely not the beast that it once was. Karma Lux, you know, just nobody's playing this deck. Pirate Aggro and Endor really fallen off to the wayside, as other Noxus aggro decks have come up, as well as just a lot of other Shadow Isle, Freljord decks, and even Mist Wraiths, you know, kind of going into the limelight has hurt Endor's playability, which I mentioned again in that Mist Wraith video that I made, I think it was yesterday. I mentioned that like Endor doesn't really count as a fearsome deck because it doesn't attack the weaknesses that fearsome attacks in the meta. Decks like Star Spring and Back Alley Poker with this, I have 4 fearsome attackers on turn 3 or 4, you know, what are you going to do about it? Endor just doesn't really do that. They're a little bit more combo oriented. They have a little bit more strength, but overall, you know, it's just not attacking the same weak points. And then I don't have Lucian anywhere on the tier list because we just haven't seen a lot of Lucian decks. You know, he's not getting the tournament spotlight just yet, so I'm not sure which version people are going to be running in tournaments and therefore can't accurately place it on a tier list. But let's talk about lineups. So a non-insignificant amount of time has passed between the last clip and this one, where I'm just staring at this tier list trying to tell you what an average tournament lineup is going to look like. If you sit down across from your opponent, you know, and you're 2-0 or something, I would like to be able to tell you what they are probably running, but I just can't do it. There's still, I mean, you see this, there's an insane amount of deck lists on this tier list. We're actually at, I think 32, but it counts tier 2 and tier 3. So yeah, there are 30 deck lists on this tier list. Let's not count tier 3 because we haven't seen some of those in a while. So yeah, 22 decks. Even if you say that I'm being generous with some of these, you know, if there's 15 decks that are meta viable, it's really hard to narrow it down to the 3 most popular ones. What I can tell you, what I will tell you, is that Shen Fiora is still very popular among players. You know, Shen Fiora is probably going to be in a lineup. Frostbite midrange, still the boogeyman of the format. But then, when you look at the leftover regions, we have Targon, Shadow Isle, Bilgewater, and Piltover and Zaun, and there's a lot that you could do with that. And Frostbite midrange isn't even necessarily guaranteed. Shen Fiora isn't guaranteed. You know, some people want to play Draven Ezreal, and generally, if they're going to be playing Ezreal, they're going to be running it in the Noxus fashion. There's Swain, there's Draven, there's a couple of different ways to do it. But, I mean, there's a couple different Ezreal decks even. There's no guarantee that they're going to be running sort of a standard Ezreal deck. There's just so many different things that your opponent can be running. But I would say that if you're looking to pick on something, don't. It's probably not going to work out. Frostbite midrange would be the safest bet, but even that's not guaranteed because, the tournaments are kind of small stakes. Frostbite midrange is kind of a sweaty deck, and it's not the most fun deck in the world to play. So if you're going for a smaller tournament like the Online League Series, there's no guarantee that people are going to be running it, and you might just get bodied if you try to pick on it. I would definitely say, right now is a time in tournaments to try to play to have fun, which is generally not something that I'm going to encourage you to do. Generally, I'm like, yeah, get in there, get your money, and leave, but it's just a little bit too difficult to tell you what an average lineup is going to look like. Now, I can tell you what I would run this weekend, and maybe that is, good enough for you, as long as I can give you, hey, this is, something that a player would run in a tournament. So let me tell you what I would run this weekend, because that's probably the best that I can do, right? So I mentioned that Star Spring was something that I've been a big fan of in the past couple of weeks. This week I'm really on the back alley poker. I like it with Gangplank. It's weird that I can even tell you what deck I would run and then pick the flavor of champion that I want to be running as well. I've been playing a lot of Leona Asol as well, and Leona Lux and Lux Asol, just trying out every different combination. Generally I go Demacia. I've played a couple Shadow Isle versions as well, but in tournament I would go Demacia because I'm already committed to my Shadow Isle to back alley poker, and I do think this has a good spread of matchups. I'd probably ban the Frostbite midrange because, that is something that, it's a very respectable ban. It's a good ban strategy across the board, and maybe I just hit every Freljord deck because I want my Demacia removal to have some kind of value, and then I probably round it out with the Draven Ezreal. I'm a big fan of just kind of playing the flavor of the week Noxus deck. That's always kind of been my style, and then so here I'd be leaving out Ionia and Freljord. I don't feel too bad about that. Yeah, this is probably what I'd lock in for the weekend if I was going to play in a tournament. It looks like a pretty solid lineup, right? This is not something you necessarily love to run into, but I mean, that's really all I can give you guys, right? I've talked about how there's just so many decks. You can really run whatever you want. These are just sort of the most powerful ones, and I'm trying, because there are so many different formats and you don't necessarily have to make the consideration of not overlapping on regions because of Riot tournaments and Unified tournaments. I'm just trying to keep this tier list as generic as possible in terms of I think these are the most powerful decks in the format. If you build a lineup out of any three of these decks, you're not going to feel bad about the choices that you've made necessarily. So that's kind of all I can give you guys here, and I apologize for that, but it just is what it is. It's a very open meta right now, and it might get streamlined over the next couple of weeks. I'll try to keep you more and more updated on how the seasonal format is shaping up in terms of the decks that players are talking about or looking to play, or how that's going to work out. And the Tournament Tactician before it might even just be completely dedicated to trying to craft you the safest lineup or figure out what the most people are going to be playing or something like that. But that's all for now, actually. I'm not even going to go to the camera screen. I'm just going to end it here. Thank you guys so much for watching. My name is Boulevard. Follow me on Twitter from the BLVD. Figure out when and where I'm going to be casting this weekend. And I do mean it this week especially because I have a couple of casts that I'm signed up for this weekend. I have a couple that are still up in the air that are going to be finalized probably the morning of. So I don't want to announce them because, something might come up or I might not get them or they might grab someone else, who knows. It's still a lot going on behind the scenes for me, which is great to say, but we are still definitely doubling up on casts again this weekend. I think this is my 4th weekend doing it where I'm just casting 3 or 4 tournaments because I'm a madman and that's what I'm known for. So we're definitely going to have the EU Masters restream on Caster Gems' stream starting about 9 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, as well as the Online League Series tomorrow starting about 2 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, and then Sunday is still a question mark for me. But that's going to do it for me, everybody. Thank you so much for watching and taking the time to listen to me rant about the tournament meta and this tier list that I keep updated for you every week. And as always, good luck in your tournaments.